So this is part C, the third part of the KhoodeelaarTV campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now, we discussed in the second part an updated kind of references to this byline holder called Kenan Malik. And in this piece, in this part, we are going to discuss the main kind of theme in the reference to the imprisonment for public protection, or IPP, which he says was introduced by David Blunkett. Now, David Blunkett is a blind man, and based on his blindness, physical blindness, he appeared to have made a career by basing his kind of various failures and his various activities on his being blind. Now, the published records about David Blunkett show that he is a particularly nasty piece of work. He's a racist, he's a sexist, and he's an abuser, a sex abuser of people. And Blunkett has got a name given to him by our movement, but we cannot publish it for various kind of sensitivity reasons. But it's absolutely spot on. And one of the people who was among the early kind of commenters on our name for David whatever was K. Jordan. And K. Jordan knew about this character from her kind of friends and acquaintances. And she shared the information about his sexist personality and record and so on. So all of those things are more or less accessible publicly about Blunkett. But the piece by Kenan Malik, who is still peddling the same line as the anti-Muslim, racist liars of the left-wing so-called Revolutionary Communist Party. The evidence shows that these are operatives for the UK state. The agenda that they promote and the way they secretively operate, and they're also aligned with the extreme far kind of right anti-Muslim agenda carriers, both in the UK and in Western Europe, including Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, and so on, Hungary especially. And the reason why I'm referring to all of that is, of course, to show up both the Observer and the Guardian and this stupid moron, lying, dishonest moron, Kenan Malik. He refers to the imprisonment for public protection, but he has not a single word about racism that is part of the kind of piles of hostile moves that David Blunkett kind of created or tolerated or encouraged. But the most important objection I have, evidentially, to Kenan Malik and his stupid piece in today's Observer is this: he doesn't have a single reference to a single instrument, that is a constitutional law term, instrument that is an act of parliament or a piece of legislation, whether published, passed, enacted directly, or as part of the international treaty obligations through the membership or signatures or signatory status of the UK. Now, most of the things that the imprisonment for public protection and this pseudo sympathetic piece about the white poor and the white vulnerable and the white working class, most of the issues that arise from this treatment or this type of treatments are already dealt with by the dozens of treaties and charters and conventions, to all of which the UK remains an active signatory. And this stupid Kenan Malik, who peddles himself as a kind of academic, who was brainwashed at Sussex University, so-called, and like other mental slaves with ethnic background or kind of ancestral background in Asia or Africa, Kenan Malik writes as if the international society or community did not exist. And yet, any study, any examination of the UK state of legislation, state of post-UNO foundation decades will show that until the UK became a signed up member of various treaties and organizations and charters and agreements and conventions, the main body of the written parts of the legislation, because there is no simple code called the British Constitution, which is supposedly unwritten, but that's not true. All the acts of parliament, as well as the significant parts of the so-called common law, constitute the Constitution de facto. But whatever the kind of refined distinctions between a written constitution and an unwritten one, the truth is that the UK's legislation and the UK's constitution, the UK's written collection of acts of parliament collectively were very backward indeed. And the idea of signing the UN's founding declarations or the kind of convention of the European Human Rights Convention, the European Human Rights Convention, which has been renamed, as you said. So it's a bit confusing because memory brings up the previous name, which was in place for a very long time. So those obligations, if implemented by the UK state and its agencies and institutions, would make this kind of provision, fascistic provision against the so-called vulnerable that this idiot Kenan Malik sort of decries, partly decries, ignorantly decries, while without fully examining and denouncing and exposing it in the way that we are doing or we do. And Canon Malik doesn't say anything about the so-called passing of the laws, passing of the statutes and the passing of the statutory instruments, etc., by the British kind of regimes, the British Parliament, the British government. And Canon Malik is not alone. It is the norm, it is the pattern, it is the reality of Fleet Street. I mean, the Observer on a Sunday is supposed to be the more informed and liberal kind of part of Fleet Street on a Sunday. But it's not. It has got a patchwork of trendy, superficial pieces all over the place. And it doesn't hold to account any of the decision-making personnel inputs, either as government or as opposition. And this has been going on. This kind of stance has been going on for, well, in the case of the Observer, for more than 200 years. The Observer and the Times, the Murdoch-owned Times, are more than 200 years old, I think. So what we can find about the Observer and how long it has been being published, we can see so the Observer, the entry on the internet, on the Observer, the wiki entry, how long has it been in existence for? So let's see what the wiki says. So it's the Observer says that it was founded in, actually this week, 4th of December, 1791, that is 229 years ago, this week, this very week. So and it is described as the political alignment being center-left. As of July 2020, it has got 140,100 copies circulated in print. And it has got a long entry on the Wikipedia. And we shall see what it says about, or what this entry says about the and there is no reference There is absolutely no reference in that Wikipedia entry on the Observer to the international role or international duties or obligations that arise from the currently active status of the United Kingdom as a signed up member of various treaties and organizations. And the fact that it has been going on for 229 years this very week may give the impression, if anyone mentions that kind of length of time, that it has been doing things very liberally, trendily described here on the Wikipedia entry as center left, which is a lot of rubbish peddled in the English kind of language discourse. Center left is as bad as center right. Remember why? Because it's the center. Right and left and center, all of them are of the same thing. Imperialist, racist, and in denial, and in dark ages. Various periods of the dark age, if you like. The Observer is racist, and it only has people apparently on the staff, if you like, or as columnists, as this one, Kenan Malik is, or African origin or African name, minor contributors on strictly rigid condition of them serving the racist agenda and the agenda of denial. Now, there is nothing in the 229 years history of the Observer of leading, championing what is essentially contained in the founding declarations and charter of the United Nations Organization and the significant kind of imitation, if you like, of the that is in the Treaty of Rome, including the various amendments that have taken place in the last decades. The Treaty of Rome is one piece, and the United Nations founding declarations the other piece. Objectively speaking, these are the two pieces of international agreements for a very long time that actually appreciated the need to stop the dark ages and create a semblance of civilization, a civilized kind of behavior within, quote, nations or member states, and among and between nations, members of the United Nations and other international forums. Leaving aside the military industrial complex alliances, like what was CETO and NATO. These are the military alliances. Leave aside the military alliances, because the NATO failed to protect citizens of member states or citizens of Europe. Muslims were being genocided and massacred. And John Major was the prime minister, and Malcolm Rifkind was cabinet minister, significantly in the name of defense. And Rifkind is a racist liar and hater, and Major had problems. And Major was kind of a captive, a prisoner, not only of the bastards, Brexiteering bastards, he named as John Redwood, Michael Portillo, and the poisonous Peter criminal Lilly, in a apparent kind of unintended conversation he was having, which was recorded, apparently, according to his kind of side, he's not being aware, by the then crew working with the IT and political editor, Michael Branson, Brunson. And the IT and Michael Branson correctly decided to report John Major's description of Peter Lilly, Michael Portillo, and John Redwood as the three bastards. So these three bastards were not the only bastards in John Major's so-called cabinet. And the put paid to the urgent need to involve Britain in rescuing the victims of the genocide that was going on against the Bosnian people and the other Muslims in that part of the Balkan. And Clinton too failed to involve the USA in helping the victims of genocide that was going on, because they were Muslims, the victims. Clinton was in the White House. So anyone who fantasizes that Joe Biden would dramatically make things better than Trump when it comes to human rights upholding and so on will have to kind of review any expectation or optimism by referring to the history of the role of the presidents of the last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. Even Churchill went to the humiliating extent of repeatedly begging for American help against the Germans, against the Nazis. All is recorded in the books and accounts that have been published in the last decades. So the United Kingdom was already a signatory to the United Nations founding declarations, charters, etc. And yet it failed. Or it chose not to help the Muslims who were being massacred and genocided in Europe during the early 1990s. And the UK's opposition in Parliament, which was at that time John Smith or whoever, failed to oppose the genocide because the genocide victims are Muslims. And Jeremy Corbyn was an MP already. He had been already an MP for 10 years plus. There is no record of Jeremy Corbyn sacrificing any of his parts and privileges as an elected MP in order to expedite or make happen an intervention by the UK to rescue the victims of the genocide that was going on. Nor did Ken Lying Still Livingstone, nor did George Galloway, who was already an MP. And that was more than a decade before Galloway was ousted by Blair from the Labour Party. So what we are looking at in the Canon Malik piece in The Observer is a criminal denial of the evidence that the UK's imprisonment for public protection, for example, measure violated the UK's obligations under the various signed up treaties that UK remains signed up to and was already a signed up member when Blair allowed David whatever to get this through the parliament, this kind of measure. Not only is that bad for the Fleet Street liars and morons in denial of the existence of the United Nations and the existence of the international order, as opposed to the narrative of the spun by the warmongers and war traders in the military industrial complex. Members of Parliament in the UK, and I refer to the Labour Party members as well as the other parties other than the Conservatives, because the Conservatives are deemed to be for war and for racist violations of Muslims. So the expectation that the Conservatives would step in and invoke any of the treaty obligations in order to help the victims, Muslim victims of genocide. Expectation is practically nil on the evidence. And what did Keir Starmer? I mean, he was already active. He was not a, probably is not, he was not in the early 90s, he was not a kind of QC, but he was an active licensed law trader. And according to his kind of currently publicly accessible history and career, he was a kind of campaigning law trader, licensed law trader. That is absolute lies. Because although technically his link with the two kind of defendants in the defamation action brought by the multi-billionaires of McDonald's company, Keir Starmer apparently advised them or helped them kind of pro bono, that is, he didn't charge them any fees for doing whatever he did. But the bottom line is that those two were left to be attacked by the heavily funded legal assault teams hired by McDonald's. And they eventually lost the case. Now, the reason why we are mentioning this is very much current and currently valid and appropriate and relevant reasons. If Starmer kind of colludes and is complicit with Boris Johnson on major issues and decisions, the Starmer is doing the job that the Tories would have loved to do, destroy the Labour Party from inside. We are not supporters, by any means of Neil Kinnock. But even as bad a leader of the Labour Party as Neil Kinnock has been in the news today, warning the Labour Party against complicity with any Brexit deal. So that is a measure of just how bad Keir Starmer is for society. What the Conservatives and what the establishment are doing is preparing for Starmer to succeed Boris Johnson. They will stage a series of mishaps and expedite the holding of an election or a process of election whereby Boris Johnson can be replaced by Keir Starmer. So we are very actively aware of that possibility. When we say what we say about Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is not representing the Labour movement, Labour Party. Keir Starmer is a Conservative. And the Fleet Street is totally silent on this. What we are saying is unique, exclusive, world exclusive, literally, because nobody else is saying this. What the so-called extreme left on the kind of momentum side and so-called momentum-like side of the Labour Party are spewing may sound kind of extremist and kind of provocative, but they are not telling the truth because they are as much corrupt as Keir Starmer and his cabal, as Fleet Street and the various cabals that kind of control the content and the editorial that then appears in each of the titles. And there is no debate about democracy, even when the various measures by the Johnson-fronted cabal have been overdue for total rigorous examination. We are not saying that after the examination, if the MPs pass them, then that won't be democratic either. We are not saying that. What is happening is the Starmer is actually preventing elected Labour Party MPs from behaving in a democratic way by taking part in votes, which is what he did in the last week in aid of Boris Johnson. And there is no debate in the Labour Party, and there is no debate spilling out from the Parliament or Parliamentary Labour Party about any issues. Most of the Keir Starmer fronted cabal of the so-called shadow cabinet and others who kind of like bag carriers, working as bag carriers for the cabal bandwagon, they're silent on all the issues. So much so that this guy, Wes Streeting, an ultra right-wing, ultra opportunistic, kind of ultra treacherous Labour Party MP from Ilford, his guest column in the Sunday Mirror is praising Elton John to the skies. No call for that. No call whatsoever for that to be done by a sitting Labour Party MP. There is no mention of the millions in poverty. There is no mention of the hundreds of thousands facing eviction. And there is no mention of the intentionally created hundreds of thousands of homelessness, waiting lists created by local council crooks, operating an agenda of collusion and complicity with the narrative of capitalist exploitation, and all of that being done by denying, in effect and formally and informally, the relevance, the existence, let alone the relevance, even the existence of the treaty obligations that the UK is under. To not do that kind of thing, to not behave in the corrupt, oppressive, unconstitutional, illegal way that the UK regimes, government, local councils have been doing, and doing so with the de facto license from the corrupt English judicial bureaucracy at all the relevant levels. And I can only refer to the very extensive diagnostic evidential references we have aired about the utterances and the utterly stupid and corrupt role played by the first president, now ex, of the UK Supreme Court, David Neuberger. So what we are saying in this part C, is very much to do with the law. And the way that we are dealing with it is unique, and it has not been done in any kind of other program, by any other program, that is. And it most certainly is not to be found anywhere in any of the known acts of fiction about the illegality and the lack of due process. Any fiction, either by John Mortimer or by Charles Dickens, of course. I mean, Dickens was the man who has been credited for dealing with the legal system and its imperfections. He may have dealt with the legal system and its imperfections, but nowhere nearly as adequately as he should have done. In any case, Charles Dickens hasn't done any of the diagnosis that we are doing. No other writer, commentator has done so, nor are they likely to do so in the foreseeable future. What we are doing here, anyone noticing that I'm kind of concentrating my eyes on the camera needs to know that I'm trying to look at the time on the screen that is not immediately, readily, correctly visible from the distance that I'm sitting at. That's why I do this, in order to keep an eye on the time. Now, we did discuss the arrest of the new Merseyside, that is Liverpool in England, elected mayor of the Liverpool City Council. There are two elected mayors in that region. One is the regional mayor, who is a notorious kind of supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, and Joe Anderson, who is the City of Liverpool Council mayor. Now, the remit of the city of London, city of Liverpool is smaller compared to the regional mayor. But that's the only difference. In terms of democracy and in terms of accountability, either post holder can do whatever they like. They can be corrupt, they can be crooked, they can lie, they can cheat, whatsoever. Quite apart from the arrest of last week of Joe Anderson, his tenure as elected mayor, he got elected the first time in 2012. So his tenure since 2012 has been marked by regular demands for his resignation. People inside the Labour Party in Liverpool, as well as ordinary members of the electorate and communities across Liverpool, know of too many things that Joe Anderson has been doing that are illegal, wrong, and corrupt. We are not talking about the arrest of last week. We are talking about years ago. And the fact that those demands were not heeded by anybody in any kind of authority supervising the behavior of this corrupt, at that time, corruptly active, kind of directly elected mayor, shows that we are in a no man's land in terms of democratic accountability in England. There is nobody responsible when it comes to accountability, let's say, answerability, democracy. And this is so true of Tower Hamlets, of Newham, that the current kind of so-called tactical move by Tower Hamlets' existing directly elected mayor, the racist liar John Biggs, and the corrupt counterpart in Newham, Roxana fears that they will let the referendum take place in 2021 about whether the elected mayor post should be allowed to remain in place in Newham and Tower Hamlets. Despite that reported kind of position taken by both of them, the evidence suggests that the system in Tower Hamlets, the corrupt mayor post will be allowed to continue, as will be the corrupt elected mayor post in Newham. I'm saying the evidence indicates that way. I'm not saying that will be the definite outcome in both or in one of the boroughs. If both boroughs ditch, scrap, and the elected mayor post, then I shall, of course, mark that by reviewing my commentary and including that fact. But as of now, there is no indication that the operatives involved in the manipulation of the referendum in either borough will allow the ordinary electors, the ordinary members of the community to know the truth, let alone to assert fully and in time and timely their option to get rid of this corrupt and corrupting system and post. For example, during the calendar years from October 2010 until the 23rd of April 2015, that is 6 calendar years, over which Lutfur Rahman was in place as the elected mayor at the expense of, in the name of, the electors of Tower Hamlets. That regime, fronted by Lutfur Rahman, perpetrated hundreds of lies, committed hundreds of lies, and committed other wrongs. And we have significant, substantive, fact-based, objectively kind of stated evidence that Lutfur Rahman operated his so-called elected mayor regime with intentional plan to break the law, especially to break the obligations, to be accountable, to be truthful, to be transparent, to be fair, to be equal in the decisions he personally made or the decisions that were made to suit his purpose. Assuming that Lutfur Rahman was born in the 1960s, biologically born in Silot in Bangladesh before his father brought him here into the UK as a child. Whether he came to the UK in the late 1960s or early 70s or during the 70s, I cannot check that on the internet right in front of me at present, but it will be checked and we shall update the viewers on the exact kind of or approximate time and method of his arrival as a child in London. Whether he came in the 60s, late 60s as an infant, or in the early 70s as a kind of infant, slightly older, has made no difference to his outlook. And his outlook is very narrow. And his outlook is very unsuitable for basic service from a public position. Everything that was alleged against Lutfur Rahman about the abuse of his position in relation to properties, while he was still in those 6 calendar years incumbent, so-called, everything that has been alleged against him has remained on the records and unrefuted by him or unrefuted by anyone kind of on his side. And that is a very serious list of allegations. We shall be, of course, updating and continuing in due course.